Contradictions. The Bible is full of them. Or is it? Dawkins despairs. Do these people ever open the book they claim to believe is literal truth? Why don't they notice those glaring contradictions? But as someone else has pointed out, it's one thing to accuse the Bible of inaccuracies, it's quite another to prove it. The fact is, a contradiction only remains a contradiction if there is no alternative explanation. And let me tell you, there are as many explanations out there as there are apparent contradictions. Okay, let's take three examples. Incidentally, there's no great design in choosing these three, they're simply the three latest that I've come across. The first two are those glaring contradictions that Richard Dawkins speaks about in his book, his latest book, The God Delusion. Okay, glaring contradiction from Richard Dawkins, number one. In Matthew's Gospel, there are 28 intermediate generations between Jesus of Nazareth and King David in that genealogy. In Luke's Gospel, there are 41. Second glaring contradiction, and I'm paraphrasing Richard Dawkins when I describe this one. The Gospels are in complete disagreement as to where Jesus of Nazareth was born. John says he came from Galilee, whereas Matthew and Luke both agree, yes, that he came from Bethlehem, but they have different ideas as to how he got there. Matthew has Joseph and Mary in Bethlehem all along, whereas Luke records that they came from Nazareth. Third contradiction. In the King James Version, if you look at it closely, in Acts chapter 9 verse 7, the men who were with Paul as he journeyed to Damascus heard a voice. In Acts chapter 22 verse 9, again in the King James Version, just a little later on, apparently those same men on the road to Damascus heard not a voice. So which is it, voice or no voice? 28 or 41. On the surface, this sounds pretty damning. Yet a little bit of background knowledge and an understanding of the author's purpose here goes a very long way indeed. You see, Matthew wants to draw our attention to Jesus' connection with David, King David. You'll notice if you look at his genealogy, it's nicely and neatly packaged, 3 sets of 14 generations, 2 of which are after David, hence 28 generations. So it's not intended to be a completely exhaustive list. It's also worth knowing that in Matthew's cultural and historical context, it was perfectly acceptable to say that A was the father of F when you had generations B, C, D and E in between. Perfectly acceptable. And that is what Matthew does here. Why? Because he wants to fit this into 3 nice, neat sets of 14 generations. Why? Because he wants to hammer home the fact that Jesus is connected inextricably with King David. You see, in the Hebrew language, letters had numerical value, and as such, names could be represented by numbers. And incidentally, the numerical value attached here to the name David was the number, hey presto, 14. What about Luke? Well, he's part of the same cultural and historical context as Matthew, but he's not limited by the tight constraints that Matthew is. So it's unsurprising that his list is more populated. There's no contradiction here, just a difference of purpose. Okay, glaring contradiction number 2. Dawkins states in his book, The God Delusion, that Matthew has Mary and Joseph in Bethlehem all along, moving to Nazareth only long after the birth of Jesus, and that Luke, by contrast, acknowledges that Mary and Joseph lived in Nazareth before Jesus was born. Now, these are not so much glaring contradictions as glaringly false and misleading, not to mention ridiculous, statements, and they're very simple to clear up. Matthew never claims that Joseph and Mary were in Bethlehem all along, as Dawkins states. He simply takes as the starting point of his gospel, the chronological starting point of his gospel, the time at which Joseph and Mary were already there. Luke begins earlier and so gives you detail that Matthew chose to omit, namely where they were from and how they ended up in Bethlehem. Well, what about John? Well, John, Dawkins says, specifically remarks that Jesus' followers were surprised that he was not born in Bethlehem. But what Dawkins fails to understand here is that John is simply recounting the confusion amongst the crowd, not Jesus' followers, about the place of Jesus' birth. You see, the crowd knew that Jesus was from Galilee, and they naturally assumed that that was the place of his birth. If you look at the blurb on my channel, you'll see that I'm from the UK. And you might logically deduce from that that I was born there, but you would be wrong. And so was the crowd. John's first readers would have understood that his gospel was the last to be written, and his followers would have been familiar with the story and true place of Jesus' birth. Alright then, third glaring contradiction, and you'll be relieved to know that this one is not from Richard Dawkins. Did the men who were on the road with Paul to Damascus hear a voice, or did they not? In Acts chapter 9 verse 7, in the King James Version, it says they did, whereas in Acts chapter 22 verse 9, in the same version, apparently they didn't. Now you see, the problem here is one of translation. Now the Bible has been translated into many languages, and anyone who's involved in the discipline of translation will tell you that it's not quite as straightforward as it seems. By the way, that's Zach in the background that you can hear. Let me quote a Greek scholar for you, a guy called W.F. Arndt. He explains the situation in this particular instance. He says the construction of the verb to hear, akouo, is not the same in both accounts. In Acts chapter 9 verse 7, it's used with the genitive. In Acts chapter 22 verse 9, with the accusative. The construction with the genitive simply expresses that something is being heard, or that certain sounds reach the ear. Nothing is indicated as to whether a person understands whether he hears or not. That's the genitive, Acts chapter 9 verse 7. The construction with the accusative in Acts chapter 22 verse 9 describes a hearing which includes mental apprehension of the message spoken. From this it becomes evident, he says, that the two passages are not contradictory. Acts chapter 22 verse 9 does not deny that the associates of Paul heard certain sounds. It simply declares that they did not hear in such a way as to understand what was being said. And he concludes here, our English idiom in this case is simply not quite so expressive as the Greek. Okay then, 3 contradictions and 3 explanations. Now it has to be said that there are more out there. Let me just say this though, I have not yet come across a single contradiction that I have not found a perfectly plausible explanation for. I want to recommend one book to you, and there are a lot of books out there on this subject. A book called Nothing But the Truth by a man called Brian Edwards. What are we to conclude from all this? Well, I'm not expecting you to conclude that the Bible is the Word of God. I would hope that you would go away thinking that perhaps it actually might be more trustworthy than at first you thought. I would also hope that you might be a little more sceptical when someone tells you that the Bible is full of holes, that it's full of contradictions.
No!